Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, I'm David Myers, your host of today's episode, which is the second in a series exploring the historical backdrop and consequences of the 2024 election. In our last episode, Professor Lynn Vavreck discussed the historical trend lines that helped shape the decisive outcome in the 2024 presidential race. Today, our focus will begin at the national level, but will then move to an analysis of key developments at the state, county, and city levels. Do the statewide ballot initiatives, together with the improved performance of Donald Trump, betoken a shift in California politics, a lightening of the once dark blue bloc that defined the state? And what do the structural changes to government voted up in LA County and LA City point to? To help us make sense of these significant developments, we're joined today by two of the keenest political observers in Los Angeles. Raphael Sonenshein, renowned political scientist, author, and executive director of the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation, which supports governance and democracy in the Los Angeles region, and Zev Yaroslavsky, who served on the Los Angeles City Council for 20 years and on the LA County Board of Supervisors for more than 25 years before coming to teach at UCLA. Raphe and Zev offer a fine balance of theory and practice as they offer insight into the effects and impact of the 2024 election, which are not always visible to the untrained eye. Welcome, Raphe. Welcome, Zev.
Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thanks, David.
So let's jump right in. What historical trend lines jump out to you in the wake of the 2024 election? Where do you think the country has moved and over what period of time?
Well, I always think you have to not be victims of presentism, as if everything that happens at the moment is a trend line. I keep tracing everything back to Barack Obama's election in 2008. And it seems to me that reset the conversation of American politics around multiracial democracy and kind of a continuing referendum on that. And I think we're still playing that out. And although it's hard for people to see it in the midst of all the noise right now, a lot of this is a back and forth around that poll. And sometimes it goes one way, sometimes the other. Incumbent parties don't last very long in this particular formulation. And if you put it in the context of what's happening around the world, incumbent parties, both left and right, are continuing to suffer defeats in elections, rule for a while, and the winners rule for a while, and then somebody else knocks them out. So it's important to take a step back and say this is another piece of it. It's a significant piece, but nothing seems to last forever right now.
Right. Especially since we're a podcast devoted to exploring the historical roots of present-day phenomena and trying to do so while resisting the impulse towards presentism. Before turning to Zev, I just want to clarify your point about Obama. So what is conventionally thought of is that there was a backlash informed by that constant axis of American political culture, namely race. Do you mean that or something more dialectical than that?
I think it's broader than that. I think it's race, it's culture, it's gender. Ronald Brownstein's always had a very good formulation about this, of a coalition of transformation and a coalition of resistance. And it's a law of physics that the more you go in one direction, there's a reaction in the other direction. I think race is a big part of it, but it's not the whole story. Some of it is generation and certainly of gender and gender roles, not just gender, but gender roles are at play throughout the whole Western world, and including religiosity, not religion, but religiosity is very much at play everywhere. So I think this is going to go on for quite a while. I think we're divided, but it's not that one side has dominated in this, even though it may seem like that from time to time.
And by you say we're going to go back and forth means the pendulum will swing back and forth?
Well, of course, you have to worry about whether there'll be changes in the democratic system that make it less likely to be able to have those changes. I'm not at all certain that'll happen. But to the extent that we keep our current framework, history shows that the backlash faces a backlash. And then that backlash faces a backlash. That's certainly what happened with Trump's first presidency. So, and that backlash started in the first congressional elections of his first term. So nothing is written in concrete right now.
Yeah, I agree completely with Rafe's analysis, and I would take it one step further. First of all, let's understand that this was a very close election. You know, the battleground states were not won in a landslide by Trump, but he won each of them. So it looks like a wipeout, and it was in terms of the consequences of the election. It is a wipeout, but it was a very close election. The turnout in this election was significantly lower than it was 4 years ago, and I think that's something that will require further analysis when all of the returns are in, and when our colleague Lynn Vavrek does her precinct by precinct national analysis, because there's more to this than just we lost the Latino vote or we gained the Latino vote or whatever the case may be. In LA County, and we'll talk about LA County later, but this is a good example. As of now, and most of the votes have been counted now, there are 500,000 fewer votes cast in LA County in the presidential election this time than in 2020. So who are those 500,000 people who didn't vote? I suspect, and we'll get the data to confirm it or refute it. I suspect that those are people who are lower income, renters, people who are not regular voters in an urban county like Los Angeles. The election, Kamala Harris got 5 or 6% less than Biden got in LA County, and so when you leave LA County aside, but when you look at a state like Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin, the Democratic incumbent senator, won narrowly in Wisconsin. Kamala Harris lost narrowly in Wisconsin. All of those states, the Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, they were all very narrow. So I'm not sure you can draw any kind of a trend line conclusion from this, and certainly not before we see what the real votes were precinct by precinct, where you don't have when you don't rely on exit polls, which I never relied on. I think they're very suspect. But when you see when the academics take a look at the 1 million or 2 million voters in specific areas, how they voted and how they voted compared to how they voted 4 years ago, we'll have a better idea. But I agree with Rafe. People were wondering whether the 2016 election was a reorientation of the electoral populace. And people thought in 2008, when Obama won, that this was a redesign of the political architecture. Things do go back and forth. But I agree, and I want to emphasize what Rafe said. The one question mark is, will we have a democracy or a functional democracy 4 years from now compared to what we've had now? And the Republicans and the MAGA crowd has been working very hard to rig the access to the voting place, purging voting rolls, to take every opportunity to suppress the non-MAGA vote and to generate more of a turnout from or relatively increase the turnout of their vote. And that's my concern. And it's not I'm not a paranoid individual, but you can see what's coming or what attempts are coming. And when you control all three branches of government, unless you find some courageous Republicans either in the Senate or the House, it's troublesome. The other thing is that I would just add one last thing, David, is that we don't know yet what the makeup of the House of Representatives is going to be. It could be a four seat advantage for the Republicans. It could be 3 or 2. There's still at least one race in California that's outstanding. And if it's 2 or 3 votes separating, and it's bizarre that Trump has nominated several members of the Republican caucus for cabinet posts. If they all get confirmed, and if the spread between Democrats and Republicans in the House is very, very narrow, 2 or 3 votes, 2 or 3 seats, they could lose their majority. So I can't imagine that's going to that's going to sustain itself over the next few weeks.
Okay. You both raised the question about whether there would be a Democratic tradition to pick up on after the second Trump term. And our guest on the last episode of Then and Now, the aforementioned Lynn Vavreck, was somewhat confident that there would be something to pick up on. Raphe, you seem to think, if I understood you correctly, that that we would survive the Trump 2.0 presidency. On what do you base that, if I understand you correctly?
Well, I mean, you can't predict anything anymore about American politics. I mean, Yogi Berra was right when he said prediction is dangerous, especially about the future. And I think there's no question here we don't know. I will say, though, that people have to be a little careful about self-fulfilling prophecies. And I hear a number of Democrats sort of talking about how there won't be an election in 2026. I think the best stance to take in general is to say there will be an election and it will continue to operate, because if you start sort of building in the possibility, I'm not saying to be blind to the dangers that are out there. As hard as things are, this is not a democracy with no institutional strength left. I mean, there are cases where authoritarians have come to power where the democracy is only 3 years old and is completely rickety and the institutions are not built in. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I think that would be way too far, but I am not in a doom role of saying the end is nigh. And because I also think that is self-fulfilling to a certain degree. I think believing that the processes will continue actually helps the processes to continue, and to plan for it as if it's going to happen and treat that as something real. And I think there's lots of people out there who take their lead from people who talk about these things. And I think you can definitely get a lot of popularity by, saying the end is nigh. Now, that doesn't mean we're not in danger. I'm certainly not saying that, but you have to stay in the game.
Well, there's no question you have to stay in the game, but I think I do think it's not far-fetched, and it's not that there won't be another election in 4 years. The question is who are going to be the participants in that election. You're going to have what they did in Harris County a few years ago, have one drop box for ballots in the entire county of Houston, where Houston is in Texas. So you're going to make it virtually impossible for people to vote. What's going to be the nature of vote by mail across the country? If they pass if the Congress passes a law that bans vote by mail on the scale of what we've seen since the pandemic, that changes the equation. I mean, I think there's a difference between predicting doom and recognizing that there are storm clouds on the horizon. And there are storm clouds on the horizon. And this guy, the president-elect, has made it very clear where he's going, and he's exercising his promises. He's implementing his promises as we speak, and we'll see. I saw a public opinion survey on CNN this morning. 60% of those polled nationally think he's doing a great job in his transition so far. Wow. That's not the way my neighborhood feels about it, or the UCLA community feels about it. But 60% of the people think he's on the right track. Now, the other thing is he has the capacity to self-destruct too, and if he overreaches, there could be a backlash. But I don't think that, leaving all that aside, I don't think that any one election is a transformative restructuring of the architecture of American politics. Reagan certainly did for a while, and then you had Clinton, and then you had Bush, and then you had Obama. So these things, and it was a very close election. The polls were right; they said within the margin of error, plus or minus 3.5% in all of these states. They pretty much on every one of the battleground states, they had it right. It's just that it turned out that it all went one way, and that says something. And let's not forget that as a widower, I do my own shopping, which I never did when my wife, bless her heart and her memory, was alive. I now do the shopping myself. And when I go to the market and see a dozen eggs at $8 or $9, which I can easily afford, but it angers me when I go to a Noah's Bagel and see that a bagel and lox sandwich that cost me 2 years ago $4.75 now cost me almost $9. Something's amiss, and I don't think we should not underestimate that. At the end of the day, it's not all that complicated. I think the inflation is a pernicious thing. It's what cost Jimmy Carter his election in 1980, even more than the hostage crisis did. Most people, all of our students weren't alive in 1980. You were a kid, David. I remember the 17.5% cost of living increase in 1 year, and I was concerned. I was panicky. My income was fixed, and my cost of living had gone up 17.5%. This is a reality for people who live between the Hudson River and the Colorado.
Yep. Okay. I want to turn our attention now to the state of California, which is widely known and often reviled as a deeply blue state. That said, Donald Trump improved on his performance in 2020 by 4 or 5 percentage points. Kamala Harris lost 5 percentage points or so from what Joe Biden garnered in 2020. And so what do you think we are to learn from this? Is California in the midst of a significant political realignment, Raphe?
I don't know. Every state is like this. You have blue states and red states have lots of Democrats, and blue states have lots of Republicans. Have been more Republican voters in California for years than the entire population of many American states. We're that big. So this is a shift along that line. I've always thought California was a more democratic than liberal state, and that people have mixed democratic and liberal as the same thing. And that's generally true everywhere, that there's more Democrats than liberals in the United States. And we always use the terms interchangeably. I think that crime has played a big role, public safety shifts, but that's a shift over a 2-year period from the George Floyd murder to today, which is, again, like all the other shifts we see, a kind of back and forth between public safety and criminal justice. And I think the state is clearly in a phase that it's been in before of moving to the right on public safety. And I think that affects both state, county, and local elections during this period of time. I think you're seeing, obviously you saw it in San Francisco, but things don't always stay liberal. And I think that that liberal policies are kind of sometimes more precarious than democratic policies.
So what historical precedents can we look to help us understand the current moment? You mentioned that this is not the first time that we've seen.
Well, you go back to the 90s, the late 80s, the early 90s, and the state, clearly wasn't the democratic state it is today. That really happened after 1994. But we've seen this before. It's a very potent issue. It isn't an issue that lasts forever, by the way, because very often the changes the voters call for sometimes satisfy the voters for a while, and maybe there's policy changes that move, but you hope it doesn't move it back to where before, when there was a justice agenda that was quite a bit stronger. I'm not at all sure that the voters are favoring mass incarceration, for example. I think voters are sort of reacting against what they've heard about what they're seeing. So crime is always that kind of an issue. I just don't know that, again, the pendulum can't swing back yet a little bit more in a more progressive direction in a few years. I think that's the voters have a way of just doing that. They just put their own oar into the water and they say, now we're going to go this way for a while.
Zev, I want to hear what your thoughts are about this, especially in light of your last comment about inflation and the economy being so central and dispositive in determining the outcome of the election, whereas Raphe just was talking about crime as a lever propelling the California electorate to the right into the red camp. So, how do you see California's move? Economy, crime. What were the animating forces?
I think the economy was the number one issue, and I think every public opinion survey in California and across the country have shown that. I don't think there's any question it affected everybody. I think public safety was definitely an issue, and I think you saw that in Proposition 36. I think you saw that in the district attorney's election here in Los Angeles County. I think the mayor's race in San Francisco, the recall of the mayor of Oakland. Every election is sui generis. I mean, there's some unique characteristics to each election, but I think California is still a blue state. I said this to somebody a few weeks ago. We're a blue state. We're just a little paler blue than we were 4 years ago. And, people, I've always said that the electorate is a lot smarter than the political class gives them credit for. And it doesn't mean I agree with them or disagree with them, but I think they vote their interests. And what you saw here in California, first of all, I don't know what the difference between 2020 and 2024 was statewide, but let's take LA County again, which I'm very familiar with. Who were those 500,000 people who didn't vote this time, who voted last time? And why didn't they vote? Did they sit home on the couch? Was it a matter of inconvenience? Was it a matter of a statement? I don't know the answer to that, but clearly that's a significant drop. And I think, for example, the last time I checked, the Democrats lost 3 seats in the state assembly elections. That's the first time in quite a while. Raphe, you probably know this better than I do, but for the last many years, the Democrats either held their supermajority or increased it. They still have a supermajority, but they lost 3 seats. Lost a state Senate race in Orange County. First time, I think, in a while that the Democrats were in the minus category on the state Senate race. So, but I do think that this was a mid-course correction election in California. The Washington Post, which endorsed Proposition 36 of all things, called it a mid-course correction. That the public felt that things had gone too far in the progressive direction, and they wanted to bring it back. That was the message that Hochman, the winner of the district attorney's race in Los Angeles County, put out there. He's not going to take it, but to the extreme right, but he's going to bring it back to the center. I think Raphe is right. Liberals or progressives and Democrats are not necessarily congruent in terms of their numbers. And I think, Prop 36 won handily everywhere, got 70% of the vote statewide. It probably got close to that in Los Angeles County. That doesn't mean it's becoming a conservative MAGA county or a conservative MAGA state. But in a close election, which California was not, but some of these state legislative races were close, and certainly in the battleground states, a slight tilt to in one direction or the other can make the difference between a Democrat or Republican.
Okay, so let's drill down on what you're both describing as a kind of lightening of the hue of the blueness of the California electorate. You made reference to Proposition 36, which called for increased sentencing for certain drug and theft crimes. And in this regard, we should mention Measure 6, which would have eliminated a constitutional provision allowing for involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons, which was voted down. We can point to Measure 5, voted down, to provide bonds to provide for affordable housing, measures calling for an increase in the minimum wage, voted down, measure calling for the repeal of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, voted down. All of these would seem to push in the direction of the red. And on the other hand, we have Measure 3, which amended the Californian Constitution to recognize the right to marry regardless of sex, race, or sexual orientation. Conflicting signals, competing vectors. How do you understand that, Raphe?
Well, Zev raised a question that we don't know the answer to, which is who didn't vote. And the numbers that are coming in across the country appear to indicate a severe decline in Democratic voting participation in the election. And if that's true, it kind of complicates the answer to your question, which is who comes to the polls. When you go to the polls, that's the fundamental decision. Once you get there, you're going to vote your ideology, your identity, your beliefs, and your experience. And if a lot of Democrats, for many complicated reasons, did not engage this year in the election, it kind of changes a lot of things. Now, it also means for Democrats, restoring the faith of their own voters may be priority one, although what people keep telling them is that they should, kind of do, I don't know what. I mean, they're being told to do 30 million contradictory things, but very few people are saying, are you speaking to actually your own voters right now? I don't just mean your progressive voters, your Democratic voters. A lot of these measures were very confusing. I think it was Nevada that passed a similar thing on the involuntary servitude thing that was much more clearly expressed. And that's a much less democratic state than California. I didn't understand half the measures. I kept trying, kept, reading everything I could find. These are, I don't know what, I think 36 is the one that sent the clearest message. My guess is on minimum wage, most people thought that was already the minimum wage and didn't understand why they were voting on it. But the one on same-sex marriage is fascinating because that issue's popularity now. Talk about a reversal of fortune. In 2004, that was the death of the Democratic presidential campaign. Now it transcends party lines. My guess is a host of Republican voters voted for that measure, that actually is now becoming one of these kind of settled issues. So that kind of stands off here to the side. The other, there's confusion, and it's also a question of who voted and who. And if I didn't understand the number of these messages, and God knows I should understand these things, but I still think the missing electorate this year, it's usually a myth that if only my voters came out to vote, is the story of losing candidates for about 300 years. This year, it may actually be true. It may be that missing hole in the electorate really was terrible for the Democrats.
Yeah, I want to talk about in a minute the structure of government, especially at the county level. But I'm just wondering, in light of what Raphe said, Zev, what do you think about propositions and measures of this sort as a means of doing the business of the people? Because if Raphe Sonenshein can't understand a measure, woe unto us. Is this an effective way to go about doing the business of governance?
Well, I will I will disagree with Rafe on one thing. I think he understood more than he's letting on. But I get what he's saying. I had more people asking me about the involuntary servitude in the prisons measure than any other measure on the ballot. They just didn't understand what's the reason for it. What are the implications for it. And I study these things. I'm not sure. I mean, I understand what it was, and I was a supporter of it. I don't think that the proponents of it had the resources to make their case. And on the one that you mentioned on the statewide housing measure, that really wasn't a housing measure. And this goes back to my point that the electorate is not as uneducated as we think they are sometimes. That measure was really a measure to reduce the number of votes, the percentage of votes required to pass certain taxes statewide, and that was in the ballot title. And people,
I should just say, I had no idea.
Yeah, that's because what's happened, and I have to plead guilty to this because I ran and sponsored a number of ballot measures. The way you write the ballot title, which is what you see on the ballot when you look at your sample ballot or you go into the ballot box, the voting booth, you look at the first thing you do is you look at the measure and you see what it says. Well, the way we used to write it is in order to cure cancer, when we had a measure to save the county health system, practically, and I'm being polemic here, in order to cure cancer, in order to cure inflation, in order to cure all of the ills of society, and then at the very end, would you support a half-cent sales tax increase for X? And my colleagues in the public opinion survey business who write these and draft these ballot titles are very sophisticated in the way they do it, but it doesn't always work. And yeah, you didn't know about it. I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about it, but the editorials up and down the state, that's one place where older voters get their guidance as well. And it failed, and it wasn't even close. It wasn't a blowout, but it wasn't. But at the same time, David, the voters in LA County voted to increase their sales tax by a quarter cent for homeless housing and homeless services.
Measure A. Yeah.
Measure A. And while Measure A passed, it passed by significantly fewer percentage points than it did in 2017 when it was on the ballot. It got over 70% of the vote then. It got in the mid to high 50s in this election. And by the way, that should be a wake-up call to the public officials in LA County that there's a limit to how many times people are going to vote to tax themselves if they don't see any results. And even though I know that there are results, and Mayor Bass and the County Board of Supervisors are doing everything they can to put a dent in the homeless population, the general population still driving around Los Angeles sees encampments, and they don't see the progress. So it's a challenge to them now to up their game and to get more people housed, and that, which is why I think the majority of the people voted for this measure, to give the powers that be one more shot at putting a dent in this. But so there are some conflicts here. On the one hand, you have this measure passing. On the other hand, the measure on the Proposition 5, I guess it was, or 3. Which one was it? The housing one.
5.
5. So
State Measure 5.
State Measure 5 loses, but again, I think people are discriminating when they have information. They can be discriminating in how they're voting on things.
Right. So you're saying even though it passed by a smaller percentage, and therefore
absolutely. And I warned about this before the election in a forum we had at UCLA, and as it turned out, I was right on the money on this. People want to solve the homeless problem, but they don't want to spend good money or throw good money after bad. And that was a challenge. The pro side prevailed, but this may be the last shot that we have at the local level.
Okay, so that last shot is going to fall upon county officials whose own sort of political organization has undergone a shift in the wake of County Measure G, which amends the county charter to create an elected county executive, creates an independent ethics commission, establishes a nonpartisan legislative analyst, and significantly increases the Board of Supervisors from 5 to 9 elected members. You both have been deeply concerned with the form, function, and efficiency of both city and county government. Zev, you have an insider's perspective on this. What do you think the effect of County Measure G will be?
Well, I think the most significant part of Measure G is the creation of an elected county executive, a county mayor. I think it's the most transformative reform in county government, maybe in the history of county government in Los Angeles County. And the way it will change, it will put one person in charge of, and one person who will be accountable for the functioning of county government. Today, you have the county of Los Angeles is 10 million people, 10.5 million people. If it was its own state, it'd be the 12th largest state in the United States. The 12th largest state in the United States, I believe, is North Carolina. They have a governor and they have a bicameral legislature. If I went to North Carolina, to the capital city of Raleigh, and I said, boy, do I have an idea for you. Get rid of your governor and your legislature, elect a 5-member board. They'll make the decision, a 5-headed executive. I wouldn't be able to get to the Appalachian border of North Carolina fast enough. They'd drive me out of there. You wouldn't run a government this big, or a company or a nonprofit this way. Somebody's got to be in charge. How does that manifest in Los Angeles County? And I'll use one example. And it's a recent one, the pandemic. Barbara Ferrer, who's the public health director of Los Angeles County, had to negotiate with 5 supervisors because you had 5 shades of opinion about what to do about the pandemic. And I'm using these extreme examples for illustrative purposes. You had one person who wanted to shut everything down, one person who wanted to keep everything open, and then there were 3 people in between. And Barbara Ferrer had to negotiate with these 5 folks. Meanwhile, the virus, you can't negotiate with the virus. It has a mind of its own. And and it was a problem for them. It was a problem when Martin Luther King Hospital for 30 years ran as an incompetent hospital that finally we were forced to shut down and reimagine. Why was that? Because nobody was in charge. And so I think that's going to be a huge bully pulpit, as well as a very powerful position, probably the most powerful position, local government elected office in California. And I think that's a good thing. And, I've always advocated for this and written about it, and I'm thrilled about it. The other things, the expansion of the board, as long as you have an elected executive, expanding the board from 5 to 9 is not a bad idea. It's not earth shaking, but I would, there were some who were proposing expanding the board without having an elected executive. And if you don't like the 5-member board, you sure aren't going to like the 9-member board without an elected executive. Somebody's got to be held accountable to the electorate. So that's my view.
Okay, let's hear Raphe on this, because Raphe has both studied and implemented change in the form and organization of city government, government at the local level. What do you think of G? Raphe?
Well, first of all, I think this is a political miracle, and I don't use the word miracle lightly in terms of politics. I actually literally could not believe that it happened. The history of this goes way back. You know that in 1855, the county of LA had 5 elected supervisors who had legislative and executive authority. The county finally got a charter in 1911 and implemented it in 1912, and of course continued the exact same system. 57 out of 58 counties in California have exactly the same system. This system was experimented with by city government more than 100 years ago after the Galveston flood. It's called the commission form of government, where they replace their mayors and councils with mostly a group of business people, numbering 5, who had legislative and executive authority. After cities played around with it for a while, they all dumped it because it was not a good system, and cities moved to either council manager systems or mayor council systems. And I discovered in my new job at the Haynes Foundation that 48 years ago, the Haynes Foundation funded the creation of a citizen commission on county government that came up with a beautifully designed and researched report calling for an elected mayor and a 9-member board of supervisors. It was defeated twice by the voters. Those reports, which have all the research you even need today, are sitting on our shelf at the Haynes Foundation. Janice Hahn's father, Kenneth Hahn, pursued this with great intelligence and effort in the 1970s, couldn't get it done. My colleague Zev Yaroslavsky was a big leader on this for a long time and alerted people to what he just said. Don't increase the size of the board without having someone who is accountable. This is, I think, potentially the biggest change in American county government that I have ever seen, because county government in this country has sort of been bypassed by the big reform movements that have mostly been about city governments throughout the state and throughout the country. People are revising the charters constantly in the city of LA, but not in the county. This is nothing else is going to cause counties throughout California. They may not adopt this, especially smaller counties, but they certainly may say, hey, maybe we should look at our government. How are we doing? Maybe we should have a charter. There's, 14 charter counties right now. The thing is, the real trick of this one is going to be the implementation. There's going to be an implementation task force. And what I'm thinking is, let's do it right, because this is so significant. Don't just cut the ribbon the way we tend to do in government and then walk away. Make sure the thing really works and that it really works well. But you do have models called checks and balances at the federal, state, and local level. The only place we don't have it is at the county level.
Yeah, I would, I've used the example, the fact that the default in the state constitution, the default is that a county has 5 supervisors, and then they run the show. But every county, every chartered county, has the right to create whatever system they want. An elected mayor, no elected mayor, more or less supervisors. But and as Raphe says, 57 of the 58 counties rely on the default of 5 members. Now, Mono County, where cows outnumber people about 100 to 1 during the summer months, has the same governing structure as Los Angeles County, which is bigger than North Carolina, population-wise. So, and nobody, no one person is accountable. And when I want to harp on this for 1 second, the Martin Luther King Hospital fiasco would never have lasted for 30 years if there had been an elected county mayor, because that elected county mayor would have understood that it was an existential threat. That failure to fix it was an existential threat to his or her political future. But when you have a 5-member board, nobody's in charge. When 5 members are in charge, nobody's in charge. And so I think this is and the implementation is critical. And I've talked to Supervisor Lindsay Horvath, who occupies the seat I did for 20 years. And by the way, she deserves a lot of credit, as do the other supervisors, 3 of them who put this on the ballot and brought it across the finish line. The key is to do it right. And there are a lot of T's and I's that aren't crossed and dotted in this measure. And the text of the measure allows them to fill in the blanks, and how they fill in the blanks is going to be critical. And but no question that the elected executive is going to be running the county, and the board of supervisors will be more like a legislative body, not exclusively. They'll have a role to play here, but it won't be exclusively the board's responsibility to run the county anymore, and it should never have been.
Right. So I hear your point that this is a very rare example of a significant, even revolutionary structural reform at the level of county government, which is sort of the great unknown in the American political system, with enormous power and very limited accountability. But in the last segment of the podcast, I'd like to talk about changes at the city level, 2 amendments or measures of note. Amendment DD, which amended the city charter to establish a redistricting commission to redraw council district lines every 10 years, and Measure ER, which fortified the city ethics commission. Raphe, what's the import of these 2?
Well, first of all, let's talk about where all this reform came from. It's from the release of a set of recordings in October of 2022 that pretty much blew up City Hall, and in some ways, for a short time, blew up the local political system, where 3 elected officials and 1 labor leader made disparaging comments, both about the African-American community, but other communities as well, about redistricting, which had just been very contentiously completed at City Hall. And the city council really had to pull itself up off the ground. It basically overthrew the leadership of the city council, and the council realized that it had better get moving at least on fixing redistricting. And what was available and popular now is independent redistricting, which the county already has, but because the state forced them to do it. The state of California has it. And it took a while, but they got it on the ballot, and in the process began talking about ethics reform. I think they did a decent job on ethics reform. They left out what I think is the most important recommendation of a group of academics and others who looked at this, which is to let the Ethics Commission put reform measures on the ballot directly, the way they can in San Francisco. But, that's for another time. Talk about miracles. It would have been a miracle if either of these had failed. If you would like to run a winning campaign, run it on independent citizen redistricting where the council members don't draw their own lines, and strengthening the Ethics Commission. I can't figure out how you lose that election. But it's all based on the fact that reform usually happens because something has blown up in the system. And Measure G actually grew out of this because the energy of what was happening at the city washed over to the county.
Interesting. Wow.
And I think in many ways it all comes down to, as often does, a highly awful event that really gets people. A lot of these measures had been just drifting in the city council chamber and to some degree over at the county. They weren't going anywhere, and suddenly they had energy.
We should mention here just the most direct electoral consequence of that event, that leaked conversation from October 2022, which was Isabel Jurado's decisive victory over Kevin De Leon in Council District 14. Zev, we have about 2 minutes left. What are your thoughts about these developments at the city level?
Well, I agree with everything Raphe has said. This was low hanging fruit for the county, for the city council to put it on the ballot and for the people to vote on it. And I also agree that, but for that, I don't think Proposition G, the county measure, would have passed. It very narrowly passed, 51.5% to 48.5%. It's a very close election, which also cries out for a thoughtful implementation measure here, because or effort here, because if they don't do it right, this was not a mandate for reform in the county government. This was a very narrow result. On the Gerardo and other elections around the county, around the city, the city has changed and is changing, and the progressive movement in Los Angeles, especially in the central part of the city, are very strong, and they have a very well organized political operation. It's conceivable that De Leon would have had a hard time getting elected even if he hadn't have been in that room where the recording was made. Adrien Nazarian, who won election in the North Hollywood, southeastern part of the San Fernando Valley, he won with 53% of the vote, and he had the support of the political establishment, and he's a former assemblyman, etc. So there is a movement afoot, more than afoot. You're seeing the complexion of the city council, and I don't mean racial complexion, but political complexion in the city council changing. And you now have, with Gerardo's election, 4 progressives, and there's an election in 2 years. This is going to be, there's definitely a shift to the left in city politics, at least in those districts which represent a poorer, renter-based community, and that I can say, going back to our first question, I think there is definitely a trend line happening in city government in that regard.
Which may point to competing vectors, national and state currents moving in one direction, city currents moving in another. We're now going to move to our lightning round, and we're going to ask you both to do something you don't relish doing, which is to make one political prediction about the next 4 years. Zev.
On the national level you're talking about?
Any level you would like.
I think it's going to be, on the national level, a very chaotic 4 years. Maybe in the first 2 years, it'll be a very chaotic environment, political environment. And where this leads, I don't know. It's hard to predict, and I'm a very loyal adherent to Yogi Berra's philosophies, especially on predicting the future. So on the local level, I think in the next 2 years, you got a mayor's race coming up. I think Karen Bass is doing. I think the voting public wants her to succeed, and they're willing to give her a lot of slack in doing that. But she's got to show some results, as does the city council. And if they keep the momentum going, I think Karen Bass, if she runs again, and she is running again, will be reelected. But we have a lot of problems locally, and the problems are much bigger than any one city can solve on its own. And what worries me about the next 2 to 4 years is that the partnership that has existed between cities and the White House, cities and Washington, in terms of funding, in terms of efficacious policies that partner with local government to solve some of these serious problems and challenges, that there's going to be a retrenchment in Washington, which is going to make it much harder for local government to do its job. And in Los Angeles in particular, we've got an Olympic Games coming in less than 4 years, and the city is relying heavily on a fiscal partnership with the federal government. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that is not a casualty of the November elections.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. Raphe, take us out.
Like Zev, I cannot make any predictions about the national scene except chaos, confusion, and it'll be a lot clearer in 6 months. At the local level, I would keep in mind that just like throughout California, there is a great growth of the progressive base, especially on the east side, especially with younger voters, but citywide, it's not quite as progressive. And in fact, there's other districts that have moved to the right, say in the west side, that had previously been the kind of core of the most progressive folks is now more centrist. And citywide, I think somewhere between those is where the sweet spot will be in 2026. I think like Zev, I think Karen Bass has a lot of people wanting her to succeed, which, in politics these days, you know how rare that is. Usually there's more schadenfreude than there is wanting somebody to succeed.
Goodwill.
Yeah, but she's got a whole lot of things on her plate. And, the quality of life issues in the city are going to be really urgent. But I think also finding a path citywide, which incorporates both the growing progressive side and also a very strong centrist side in other parts of the city, is really going to be the key to success going forward.
Well, this has been a really rich conversation. I want to thank Raphe Sonenshein and Zev Yaroslavsky for sharing their unparalleled knowledge and insight into politics from the national to the local level. Thank you for being with us on Then and Now.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.